up is from Dhanani called Don't Panic, a Developer's Guide to Building Secure GraphQL APIs. And Meena, I know when I hear security, I panic. So I hope that my heart's already racing a little bit. I hope you can calm me down through your presentation.
Yeah, maybe that, or like get you to panic even more. So
that's probably how I'm going to feel. But that's just me. I'm not very good at security, so I'm looking forward to it. And yeah, we'll let you take it away. Thanks so much, Meena.
Thank you very much, Meena. Good luck. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex and Brian. I think that's a lovely start to the day. It's night for me, though. I'm the one who's from Pune, India, so it's like 9:39 p.m. here. But anyway, hello, welcome to my talk. So Don't Panic most definitely is a reference to one of my favorite books of all time, if you've read it. It's called Hitchhiker's Guide to Galaxy. And so since I work at Postman, and Postman also has a GraphQL client, among other things, you should definitely try it out if you haven't. We're always looking for feedback. Oh yes, but basically, so I've moved my focus specifically to understand and learn a little bit more about GraphQL practices and the community. So this is my humble attempt to guide you through building secure GraphQL APIs. Oh, also a little about me before we get started. So I go by Meena, but Meenakshi is actually my full name. And you can follow me on Twitter using that handle, or maybe I should even try out Mastodon or like other platforms that are there. So give me a cheer in the chat if you like yoga like me or working out and strength training. And I'm definitely a morning person, which means I'm going to sleep almost right after the talk. And I'm a wannabe Spanish lover. So please teach me some Spanish with your questions or anything that you chime in on the chat with. Funny story, I recently got lost and locked out of the Postman San Francisco office, but I visited there for the first time. So yes, I highly doubt you can beat me at getting lost. Back to GraphQL. So GraphQL is just an API, right? That's what I thought, or that's what I think too. But like news does to most people, I did read a few articles and think they kind of scared me. So I'm going to share a few of them with you. This one's from March 2022, which is not too old. And it says that GitLab allowed an attacker to collect user information only because of a missing authentication check for certain GraphQL queries. And there's another one. WordPress has a GraphQL plugin, which has suffered from a denial of service attack because of a really resource-intensive query and batch attacks on their GraphQL API. And another one, if that didn't scare you enough, so this one's about Instagram. They had a bug bounty program, and the bounty hunter managed to find a vulnerable GraphQL endpoint. So even if a person isn't actually following me through that vulnerability, they can get access to all of my private posts and reels and everything that's archived too. So I think they should have handled this problem by now, but I would go back and check on my reels in case. Since I was digging, so what I wanted to do was just to get a clearer picture of the GraphQL security landscape. So the National Vulnerability Database has a list of common vulnerabilities that are exposed across different technologies, different stacks. So I did a GraphQL keyword search just to see the statistics. And it does seem like the attackers have really gotten better at attacking because the vulnerabilities seem to have increased from 2019. And so we definitely need to pull up our socks and be better at protecting our systems, at least from the common vulnerabilities that are already known. And one of my larger mistakes was thinking that GraphQL APIs would be secured just like other APIs, because I just considered GraphQL to be an API, right? But like Tristan from Escape Technologies says, it's also a language which definitely broadens the attack surface, and that makes it much larger than regular APIs. So I did mention I work for Postman, right? So I had to make a collection to understand more about the vulnerabilities that I could find. So I took this opportunity to use the API. So the National Vulnerability Database has an API, and that API can give me a list of all of the GraphQL incidents. And I want to check the descriptions of the GraphQL incidents so that I could understand, like, what are some of the common attack surfaces. And there were quite a few incidents. I actually had to scroll through the results. So yeah, and again, just for fun, and it's colorful. Also, I want to try this API out. But this is QuickCharts API. So I made a word cloud. Didn't have to put in a lot of hard work, but just made a word cloud to find out common words among the vulnerability descriptions. And there's a lot of similar words, like you will see unauthenticated, authorization. There's information, probably like relating to information disclosure. And GitLab is also a little big because there were quite a few incidents in the list of incidents that happened at GitLab with their GraphQL endpoints. So what we're going to do, as I promised in the beginning of the talk, is my humble attempt at sharing a guide with you all. We will go through some common kinds of attacks or common flaws and vulnerabilities in a little more detail. And one of the most common ones is, one second. Yes, one of the most common ones actually is relating to access control. And the first one that we might want to draw attention to is authentication. So on one of the articles that I shared in the beginning, GitLab had a vulnerability because of missing authentication checks. And that might probably not be because no checks are in place at all, but there are certain fields or certain queries that are accessing specific types or objects that aren't authenticated. And that gives an entry point to an attacker. So what's a little different with GraphQL is where we might want to place that authentication logic. And if it's possible that if the authentication logic is actually repeated in every GraphQL resolver. So if I haven't spoken about it earlier, so for every query and for each of the fields that we query, the values for all of those get resolved by a resolver. So if all of the authentication logic is at the GraphQL layer within those resolvers, one is it will be extremely tightly coupled to the GraphQL layer, and it might also cause a lot of duplication and difficult to manage, which is why it could be likely that you may miss out on adding the logic in certain places. So there ideally would be a layer just before the GraphQL server where we can define our authentication logic so that for GraphQL, it just receives maybe the authenticated user, doesn't have to worry about the authentication at all. And how we can do that is, so there is, when we're spinning up the server, over here in this example, we're actually using Apollo, but you can pass, you can have and define all of the the authentication pieces, or maybe call a service that does the authentication over here in the context. And this context value is passed on to each of the resolvers. So what the resolver receives is only maybe the authenticated user, and then can query and then resolve the query. Next, and one of the most common attacks was authorization violations. So certain type of fields must be exposed only to certain roles. And if role checks aren't in place, it's possible that your API might be leaking information. So there's a couple of ways to do these role checks. One is, so there's an option to maintain an allow list. The allow list for the roles will basically allow permissions to just the roles that are mentioned for those particular fields or attributes, and will deny the rest. That's way safer than maintaining a deny list, because what the deny list will do instead is deny access to certain users or certain roles, while giving access to the rest, which exposes and increases the attack surface. So you might want to go with an allow list that's safer. And this is a little snippet from the previous one, where we're using the context and we're finding the role from it, and then filtering and maybe resolving the values. What you can do is not write all of it from scratch, because there's a lot of middleware that's available, and there are tools like GraphQL Shield that will allow you to have rules across your schema and validations. There are also directives that you can use to define the roles for the different types of fields in the schema. Denial of service attacks, like we saw in the articles, basically block the server from responding to client requests by consuming the network and resources temporarily or maybe even indefinitely. So how can I bombard the server, get it stuck? I can make it go in a loop. So GraphQL represents the data as relations and not as resources, which means that each of these relations can refer to each other. So this one is a request where if you see the depth of this request, it just goes on querying recursively, and that can bog down system resources. So one way to mitigate this is by having depth checks in place. And there are tools and implementations that can help you add depth check validation rules to prevent these queries from executing in the first place. Okay, batch attacks. Yeah. So what GraphQL also allows you to do is each of those the requests, like the requests for each of those fields, they execute one after the other. So GraphQL will allow you to batch certain operations together, and you can have a repeated operation again and again, maybe a resource intensive one, and that's how you can bring the service, like the service down and cause a DOS attack. So in this example, system update is actually a resource intensive query, and we're again asking the system to update, which makes this really slow. So this is just an application that I spun up locally, but even with just writing like 3 times the system update, the attack took 51 seconds for that one particular request. So interesting, and what differs from REST is the way to mitigate this challenge. You can have the rate limiting in place. Also, before that, at the very least, what you could do is disable batching altogether, so that the attackers at least can't try this method. But even if there's ways to bypass batching and still do this, so what Shopify and GitHub do is they do rate limiting, which is a good suggestion. But how it differs from REST is the rate limiting isn't on the number of times that you call an API, because for GraphQL, it's probably just /GraphQL that you're calling. But every time what you request for in the query, whether you're doing mutations or the operation is something that can get costly, or even if you do a particular operation like repeated number of times, maybe it's not that costly. So what Shopify and GitHub do is they have different approaches of calculating the complexity of the query and assigning it certain points for the cost. And they have a limit on the total cost for each query. So they check it, and only if like you're within the limit is when the query will actually be executed. Yes, something like this. So this is a response from one of the endpoints that Shopify has, and the extension method is where it's so in the extension object is where the remaining points and the points used with respect to the query cost is returned. Another way, so if batching is disabled, like I said, there are other ways you can use aliases in GraphQL. So let's say I am disabled to use system update 3 times, but I can have an alias for system update, and by that I can still do the same thing that I could do earlier in the query, and I can still manage that attack. So again, rate limiting will definitely help. But also, if the API is internal and let's say it's not supposed to be exposed to the public, we do know certain queries that are being used by the application. So there is a list of approved queries, and you could allow only those queries to be processed by the system. This is an example of how Hasura does it. So it's a screenshot from Hasura's UI. And Hasura is basically a tool that will help you spin up GraphQL APIs on top of Postgres or your database. It's allowing you to define a list of all the queries that are allowed, so that it protects you against other malicious queries that like the attacker tries out. Information disclosure. So GraphQL has this great feature that's called introspection, and it's very useful for developers to find out, especially while developing, the fields that they can query and how to use an API. So what the introspection feature will do is, like in this example, like I can request and I can get the entire schema, all the queries, all the mutations that are possible on top of it. And if this is exposed to the attackers, especially for an API that isn't exposed or shouldn't be exposed outside, or is an internal API, this can disclose a lot of sensitive information. So you can disable introspection as one way to avoid these attacks. But if you do disable disable introspection, there's still error suggestions that one can use to learn more about the schema, even if they don't know. So even if in the query you just type system, what the implementation library is going to do is going to give me an error message, which will actually say, did you mean system update, or did you mean system health or something? And that's helpful in, again, gaining access to information that we didn't want to expose in the first place. So all of the examples and the request bodies in the slides, they've been taken and they've been built into a collection, Postman collection, that's in a workspace called GraphQL Security 101. And how I've been able to build a lot of this is because some very wonderful people from the community whose names I'm forgetting have built the damn vulnerable GraphQL API. That's a weak implementation of GraphQL, and it's basically helps learn and practice these attacks. So one is, I've actually used a few snippets from the attacks that you can do So maybe I should have mentioned the spoilers to the challenge if you want to try it out. But now, since I've already spoiled your challenge, and if you just want to browse through the kinds of attacks and the queries that I used for the attacks that I mentioned, you could check out the workspace, and each of those collections have examples, screenshots of which were on the slides. And the Postman collection also has folders for more of the flaws that I didn't cover right now. So like other APIs, GraphQL APIs are also susceptible to SQL injections, log injections, log spoofing, or code executions. And there are a few examples of that in this workspace too. And yes, so we're almost at the end. And now that I've shared my learnings, what I want to say is secure your APIs, get a good night's sleep. That's if you secure your APIs, of course. And don't panic. But also don't forget, it takes 20 years to build a reputation and few minutes of a cyber incident to ruin it. That's harsh, but it's true. Yes, because you don't want to forget and be calling someone to let them know, I think I've made a huge mistake. I just want to say that part. Okay, so before I end, this is a list of the resources that I used to build this presentation. And I think, like Brian and Alex said, the slides will be available, and the link to the workspace will also be available. And if not, you can search the Postman network for GraphQL Security 101, and you will get access to that collection. And yes, hi, Brian.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much for this presentation. Let's get some clap emojis over in chat, and let's get some questions in chat. I've got a couple to start us off as we wait for the delay, because there's always a little delay. First, you were talking about complexity scores when talking about like the faux rate limiting or complexity limiting. Do you have like maybe a common scale for query complexity scores? Like, is there a best practice for rating and giving levels to various things?
So I checked there's two different approaches for calculations that Shopify and GitHub do. I think GitHub gives points to the number of nodes in the query, and Shopify has points with respect to each relation. I'm going to have to refer to them, but I think they're good examples of what people could use to refer to, and the way that they're calculating the query complexity and managing the cost, and then making the response available to the user about, okay, these many points are left. Yeah, so like Shopify and GitHub, they're good examples.
Awesome. And so there's also another thing that you said with the information disclosure part, and it was actually something I never really thought about. Again, not a security person at all. About
me neither.
Yeah, fair. Even after disabling introspection, errors can help an attacker find information. Any suggestions around good error messages that are still good for developer experience, like still tell you kind of where you need to go, but are still secure and still like not giving away too much of the information?
Yeah, so I think for GraphQL, there are different implementations. So Apollo has its own implementation. There's a Express GraphQL that has its own implementation. So as far as I understand, these messages actually come from the implementations. Yeah, so you still need to protect your system by the techniques that we discussed earlier with respect to maybe approved queries or doing role checks. But yeah, that's something that can be attacked that way and can get exposed.
I got you. Let's see. We've got a question from Alex in chat. People are often the weakest link in regard to software security. I've seen enough security training to definitely know that one. How do you educate engineers about these best practices inside of either Postman or talking to clients at Postman?
So one of the ways that at least certain basic attacks, even like disabling introspection or what is it that I spoke about? No, some of the common vulnerabilities are something that engineers definitely should be aware of. trying out the Postman collection that we created is one way, but there are a lot of tools that have been built to mitigate all of these security risks. And the damn vulnerable GraphQL application that I actually used has really wonderful examples. And it's like a challenge that you can use to learn and educate yourself about how you can attack certain GraphQL APIs and what can an API expose because of a bad implementation. So that's a good practice. I definitely recommend trying that out. I learned a lot. I think I picked up most of what I use from that exercise. So.
Excellent. All right. So looking in, looks like we don't currently have any additional questions. So Meena, thank you so much for sharing these insights and for the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy reference, which I always appreciate. I didn't bring my towel today, but maybe next time. So thank you so much, and I hope you get some rest now, as it's pretty late for you.